you all remain on mute throughout the webinar, and any questions that you have, please use the Zoom chat function to submit your questions. And what we're going to do at the end of the session is collate all your questions, and then we're going to send out an email early next week to all attendees answering all your questions. Hopefully a lot of them will be covered in today's webinar anyway. We are all doing this from home, myself and the 4 members of our panel. I can see that a lot of you are doing it from home as well. So we do apologize if we have any Wi-Fi trouble. Hopefully that won't be the case. But if something happens, you know why. So a little bit of background to why we decided to have this webinar. The COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown that followed obviously had a big impact on the property market, as you're all aware of. We reopened our firm for business after lockdown in mid-May, and we have since then seen a lot of queries come in from clients with regards to what is happening in the market, how are we finding it, what are our challenges when we're valuing, where are we getting our comparables from, to name a few. There's been a lot of questions, and we thought that it would be a good idea to try to put a webinar together and try to answer as many of your queries as possible. So what we've done is we've put together an agenda with 5 topics that we think are the most pressing topics for the moment. And hopefully you will find the next hour very insightful and useful. So to start with, I would like to present our panel. We have 4 of our surveyors joining us today. You will probably be familiar with their names. You would have seen them in emails and on the valuation reports submitted to you. We have Mark Francis, who has been with the company for 9 years. Mark has extensive expertise in the London area and works predominantly with prime central London valuations. We have Jane James. Jane is based in Surrey and is our expert on Country House, which is something that she's going to be talking about in a short while. She also works across a lot of our development valuations, and she covers all of the all of the home counties really, and spends a lot of time down in Surrey doing building service and valuations for nice big country homes. We have Steve Craggs. Steve has been with us for 5 years. Along with Jane, he does a lot of our residential development work. He also does a lot of HMOs and valuations in the north London and northwest London, as he's based in Watford. And we have Chris Foot. Chris has been with us for 4 years and works Greater London and does a lot of valuations in the southwest. He's based in Chiswick, so knows the southwest of London very well, but also works Greater London and does building surveys and home buyer reports on top of valuations. So the first topic we're going to talk about is the question that everyone is asking. It is the sort of the hot topic, I guess. How has the capital market reacted to the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent lockdown, and what are the current hotspots? Now, what we've done is we've broken this into 4 categories: prime central London, Greater London, and new builds, and country house. So we are going to start with Mark Francis, who is going to give you all an update on prime central London.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and hi to everyone. So, how has the market reacted after the lockdown period? This is a view from the coalface rather than just analysing stats. We're all surveyors on the ground. So, just like a brief sort of outline of prime central London. It covers the centre, and the postcodes are NW1, Marylebone, Primrose Hill and Regent's Park, NW3, Hampstead, NW8, St John's Wood, SW1, Belgravia, Knightsbridge and parts of Westminster, SW3, Chelsea, SW5, the best parts of Earl's Court, SW7, South Ken and the other half of Knightsbridge, SW10, Chelsea, W1, Fitzrovia, Marylebone, Mayfair, Soho, W2, which is the Hyde Park Estate and Bayswater, 8, Kensington, 9, Little Venice and the best parts of Maida Vale, 11 Holland Park and Notting Hill, and 2 of the WC postcodes, 1 Bloomsbury and 2 Covent Garden, which are now prime, and also prime Riverside. So we're talking about sort of Albert Embankment, Chelsea Embankment, etc. So just a brief overview context since the start of 2020. So since the election result in 2019, when Boris Johnson was formally elected and Labour were decisively trounced, we were hearing reports of the Boris bounce effect, and investors, with a still uncertain feel with Brexit, had relative uncertainty with the new Conservative government. Now, in the first quarter of 2020, prices were beginning to rise. It was all beginning to look fairly rosy. Then all of a sudden came to a grinding halt when the UK was placed into lockdown. Travel restrictions meant home working for the majority of professionals involved in property, including estate agents, lenders, lawyers and surveyors. And for the property market, viewings were not in the main possible. The estate agents closed and the surveying profession were told to not undertake physical inspections. And this was all quite rightly in an attempt to stem the coronavirus. So lockdown started on the 23rd of March 2020, and it started to ease in the middle towards the end of May 2020. And that's when we returned to work, as Sophia has already said. So in the interim period, there was a near shutdown of the market. And this has led to pent-up demand as the desire to get on with our lives has, maybe prematurely, trumped fears over the economy. People are reassessing their housing needs, and many are taking action to find properties that meet their changing requirements. Market prices in prime central London are still below the levels of 2014, more than 20% in some parts, and there is still value to be gained, even though prices have reportedly fallen just over 1% during the lockdown period. Remember that since 2015, we've had the EU referendum, 2 general elections and 3 property tax changes, including that recently announced by Rishi Sunak last week in an attempt to kickstart the lower end of the market by increasing the stamp duty threshold up to £500,000. And this is from now, and it continues until March 2021. We'll just have to see as to whether that helps the market at all along the way. Okay, so data from Knight Frank has shown that price falls within average PCL by 3.6% to this year until June 2020. It was 4.4% to May 2020, so there are signs that it may be starting to ease. However, there are other data reports that 10% falls have been experienced since to the end of the year, but until deals have been completed, we can't say how much the market has fallen. We must also remember that the stats are based on limited information. And according to government figures, there were just 38,000 transactions in the entire country in April, which is 55% below the 5-year average. And therefore, we must be careful how we interpret these new statistics. So what we have heard is that record levels of offers have been received, with the ratio between asking prices and the achieved prices narrowing as traction returns to the market. Savills data analysis shows that the number of £1 million plus sales were up 40% on this time June of last year, with 10% up on the £2 million plus sales. Almost all agents that we are speaking to on a regular basis in prime central London are very, very busy with backup offers on the best properties. And this followed a previous cheeky offer market which emerged from lockdown. Now, this is due to the limited supply. However, buyers seem to be keeping their feet on the ground, and they'll only pay a certain amount, and the sellers need to remain realistic on their price expectations if the momentum is to continue. In other words, can this carry on? Who knows? But due to a number of people who are still on furlough, Latest reactions to the news with regards to high street names, John Lewis, Boots, and earlier today, Pizza Express, with closures and job losses ensuing, long-term job security may be a real issue. Also, the market's not been helped by the retreat of some lenders mid-transaction who withdrew mortgage offers that had previously been offered in principle due to the pandemic, meaning that potential purchasers may have lost fees and caused chains to collapse. And this has further hindered confidence. But with the record low interests likely to continue and the government support schemes, this could help. There are, however, further clouds on the horizon. Brexit's still there, rising taxes to pay for COVID-19 are likely, and stamp duty for foreign nationals will be going up next April. Also, there are still limits on international travel, which may keep some of the overseas buyers away. And of course, the dreaded second wave, which we don't even want to think about. One segment of the international market are, we have heard, keen to purchase properties in prime central London, notably from Hong Kong. So there are 3 million wealthy Hong Kong buyers who have been frustrated by interference from Beijing. And for buyers in Hong Kong dollars, which is pegged to the US dollar, it makes the London market seem really attractive. And with additional price falls since 2014, the discount can be from 40 to 45% of the previous prices. On balance, therefore, we remain cautiously optimistic about returning to a strong market in prime central London over the next few years, but it could be patchy and bumpy along the way. Savills has very recently, on the 9th of July, reassessed their 5-year price forecast. Over 5 years until the end of 2024, they forecast a total increase in prime central London prices of 15.7%, with a small fall in 2020 of 2%. Knight Franks are saying 5% fall to the end of the year. The market has performed slightly better than we thought it would. We're currently being asked by a number of lenders as to whether the valuations we undertook pre-lockdown still stand, and our response has been universal in that until such time as the market returns to normal, we really cannot say. There are no clear statistics to confirm. We are in unprecedented times and it's new to all of us. In respect of desirable properties, purchasers are even more fussy. And the best in-class properties at present include grand first floor period conversions with high ceilings and balconies or terraces, lateral flats with outside space, low built and spacious houses with good sized gardens. And we're talking of areas such as Hampstead, St John's Wood, Wandsworth, Putney, and this has been due to the fine spring that we've had since lockdown. I just wonder how we would be reacting if the pandemic had occurred in the autumn or winter. You know, would the need for outside space be so paramount? What we can say as a company is that we shall value properties based on the most up-to-date comparable evidence and will adjust it as necessary with no fair or unjustified percentage down value kind of approaches. Longer term price growth will be dictated by the extent to which COVID-19 has had on global wealth, and early indications suggest that the effect has not been as severe as we originally expected. So, hot properties at the moment: garden flats or flats with outside space, low built houses with good sized gardens in more leafy locations such as I said, Hampstead, Primrose Hill, St John's Wood, and the best parts of South and Southwest London. The experience of home working has meant that outside space has become very important, and to this end, houses have outperformed flats, and this is a reverse of the trend that has been in place since 2014. Thank you very much. I'll now pass you on to Chris Foot, who is going to talk to you about the slightly more outer areas of London.
Many thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope everyone's been keeping safe and well. As Mark has mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the Greater London property market. And before I kick off with that, I think it's worth explaining what we mean by Greater London, and that is areas which fall outside of the prime central London postcodes, which Mark has just been discussing, all the way out until we get to the home counties. So we're talking about a very broad area consisting of many different London towns and postcodes. So for example, Hammersmith, Fulham, Brixton, Peckham, Canary Wharf, and Camden. So it's the areas such as those. And I think it's fair to say that up until lockdown, the property market in these locations was relatively positive, following on from various political and economic factors in the years prior, which undoubtedly had an adverse impact on the market. So we're talking about the stamp duty changes in 2014 and 2016, as well as the EU referendum in June of 2019. And of course, the ongoing negotiations and issues which have followed, which have continued to cause uncertainty. So notwithstanding those issues, we were certainly seeing signs of positivity and generally healthy levels of demand in the Greater London area just prior to lockdown. However, completely unexpectedly, we were placed into lockdown in March of this year as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, and the market more or less came to a grinding halt. During the lockdown period, not surprisingly, the number of property transactions decreased sharply, which was due to uncertainty amongst buyers and sellers with regard to their circumstances, the potential of unemployment, etc. Not to mention the fact that physical inspections and viewings were very difficult, if not impossible, at that time. So unsurprisingly, the number of transactions decreased significantly. To try and sort of help the situation, the government have implemented various measures such as the furlough scheme. We've seen recently the change to the stamp duty land tax, whereby there will be no tax to be paid up until the value of £500,000 with reduced rates thereafter. We also understand that the Bank of England base rate will remain at 0.1% up until Q2 in 2022. So hopefully these measures will aid the market, not just in the London area, but in the UK in general. Now, the main question that we've been getting asked post-lockdown is simply, what has the market been like and what do you envisage moving forward? And I think maybe surprisingly to some people, we've seen signs of real positivity and healthy levels of demand with regard to various property types in many different postcode areas in Greater London, which I think really is due to high levels of pent-up demand from pre-lockdown. We've seen many occasions whereby properties have achieved on or even in excess of asking price. We've even seen situations where properties have gone to best and final bids, where there's been somewhat of a bidding war between multiple buyers, which clearly indicates a healthy level of demand. We've also seen numerous scenarios now where sales have been agreed pre-lockdown at a certain price, or even during lockdown. Sales have then fallen through due to changes of circumstances amongst buyers and sellers. But then what we've seen is that these properties have been renegotiated at around the same, or maybe even sometimes in excess of the initial price. As I say, that we feel is due to pent-up demand. And it's important that we don't get carried away with that, because there are still many variables and uncertainties in the market. Of course, we don't know what the true impact of COVID-19 will have moving forward in terms of unemployment. We've also, of course, got the possibility of a hard Brexit come the end of this year, which may in turn cause unemployment. So I think, you know, we mustn't get carried away with the market at the moment, but certainly there are positive signs. The challenge is for us as valuers is really to make sure that we are keeping completely on top of market conditions in whichever postcode that we're working in. So we're placing a lot of importance at the moment, in addition to obtaining completed sales transactions which are on the land registry. We're also attributing a lot of importance on obtaining comparables which are currently under offer. We're also focusing on properties which are on the market and undertaking numerous discussions with experienced local estate agents as to what the marketing history and patterns have been of these properties. And we then pull all that information together to enable us to come up with the most accurate valuation as at that date. And that is something that we will certainly continue to do moving forward in these uncertain times. With regard to properties which are particularly popular at the moment, Mark alluded to this with regard to his Central London commentary, and it's similar in Greater London areas, in that there's a particularly high level of demand for properties with outside space at the moment. So of course, houses with gardens and converted ground floor flats with direct access to gardens are particularly popular at the moment. Probably due in part to the great weather that we had during the lockdown period. So it is difficult to say how long those trends will last, but that's certainly something that we have noticed. Another thing that's worth pointing out really is that, and it's not just kind of relevant to post-lockdown, but also in general, is that the high quality housing stock is tending to hold its value better. So, for example, attractive period properties with outside space, for example, within close proximity of amenities, numerous transport links, and attractive parks, they are tending to hold their value well. And I think historically that really has always been the case. Another question that we've been getting asked is which areas still have, you know, relative good value in the London area. And I think it's the same scenario really as pre-lockdown. And there are areas where there is still good value, in my opinion. And the areas that come to mind really are South and Southeast London areas still, such as Camberwell, say the Walworth area, Elephant and Castle, and you know, those types of areas. There is still good value. These areas are typically quite popular with property investors. There are good levels of rental demand. What we see quite a lot of is investors purchasing local authority stock, because there is a large volume of local authority housing in these areas, and they tend to offer, you know, relatively good sized accommodation with 3+ bedrooms. And as I say, because there is a generally good level of rental demand, these properties are then popular with sharers and young professionals, and therefore quite strong yields are available. And in terms of activity in that investment market, we've seen no real evidence of any kind of downturn post-lockdown, albeit, you know, we've not been out of lockdown for that long, so it's obviously something that we will have to monitor moving forward. And finally, for me, I'd like to just discuss the new build market. And again, you know, another question that we're asked quite a lot is how that market has been affected as a result of the lockdown and COVID-19 as a whole. Of course, during the lockdown period, construction work came to a grinding halt, really. And, you know, even upon its return, workers and developers were having to become used to different working practices, and these things were taking time. So there's been some delays in terms of ongoing projects. And I have to say, in terms of new build stock on the whole, the pattern is very much the same as the second-hand property market, which I've just been discussing, really. And I would say that it's very much the same in that the good quality stock will tend to hold its value better. For example, 20th floor penthouses or sub-penthouses with balconies or terraces, with parking perhaps, or fantastic views across London or the River Thames. These are the sorts of properties which will hold their value better, particularly when there are numerous similar units on the market in these new build developments. The main concern really around new build is in London areas is oversupply, and that hasn't changed post-lockdown. That's been the case for some time. And the example which immediately springs to mind is the Nine Elms Battersea area, where in the last kind of 8 years or so, we've seen a significant amount of construction work being undertaken, most notably the Battersea Power Station regeneration zone. We've got the neighbouring Chelsea Vista. Further down, we have Riverlight Quay and also Embassy Gardens, where we have the American Embassy. Whilst construction work of this nature is in many ways very good for the area, because you get many commercial vendors relocating to these areas, which tends to boost the area. The issue that you get is an oversupply of similar property types being brought to the market at the same kind of times. That's the case for both sales and rentals, and you end up with somewhat of a saturated market. It's very important in that case that properties are priced and marketed correctly so that they achieve sales within reasonable time periods. That oversupply situation, certainly hasn't changed, and it's something that we're very mindful of when we value properties in these areas. I think to conclude really with my part there, the importance for us as valuers in obtaining the very best, most recent, up-to-date comparable evidence is very high, and it's something that we focus on each and every job that we do. And we really do feel that's very important in these sort of ever-changing times. And that really is everything from me. I'd now like to pass over to Jane James to discuss the country house market. Over to you, Jane.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everybody. As Chris said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the country house market and the effects of the coronavirus pandemic on that market. I'm going to talk a little bit in general terms, but then give some specific feedback on what's been happening on 2 of the private estates in that area. So that's St George's Hill in Weybridge and Wentworth in Virginia Water, because those 2 estates in particular have their own unique market. Before I start, I think I should just better explain what we at London's mean by country house. So we're talking about properties worth £2 million or more and situated within the home counties. But those areas of those counties that are closer to London. So we're talking northwest Kent, so sort of Sevenoaks, Tunbridge Wells and the villages around there. All of Surrey, to be honest, so all the areas around Guildford, Oxshott, Esher, Cobham, those sorts of places. The Surrey and West Sussex borders, so Horsham, Petworth. In Hampshire, it's the north part, so around Petersfield, East Berkshire, so Ascot, Wokingham, Sunningdale, Henley-on-Thames, South Buckinghamshire, so Beaconsfield, Gerrards Cross and Amersham. Hertfordshire, again, it's the south of the county, so Moor Park, Berkhamsted, St Albans, Welland, Bishop Stortford, and then finally in Essex, we're talking about those southwest areas, so Brentwood, Chigwell and Epping. Obviously a large geographical area. I think many of you may have seen reports in the papers recently that since the end of the lockdown, the high-end country house market has bounced back stronger than any other type of housing in the UK. And it's fairly easy to see why. I think a lot of people during lockdown, having to work from home, battling with homeschooling, and perhaps decided that if they were going to move out to the countryside, now was as good a time as any to do it. I think that together with the fact that people are finding they can work from home perhaps more easily than they thought, and are prepared to accept a slightly longer commute if it's not every day. I think it's also fair to say that properties in the shires represent relatively good value still compared to London prices. Research by Savills, which was published in April, found that prices in a £2 million plus country house market are still around 20% below their peak of 2007. And this is in contrast with London, where £2 million plus houses are about 12% above that previous peak. Obviously, this is a national statistic, and I suspect the disparity is less for the country houses in the southeast, but I think it's still true to say that a lot of these houses represent good value for money. So, all the agents we've spoken to since lockdown have all reported increased activity, a lot of demand, both pent-up demand from those who are planning to move anyway, and then lots of new enquiries from people who made the decision during lockdown to move out of London. As I say, the new inquiries are mainly from people in London looking to move out, as they perceive it to be good value. You can get a lot more house and a lot more garden for your money. There is some interest from some foreign buyers, again, like Mark alluded to, in prime central London. This is mainly from Hong Kong buyers, and to be honest with you, it's not across the board. They're looking at areas where there are good amenities, so areas close to Guildford, for example, where you can still get into London very easily, and there are some good public schools in that area. Prices are pretty much the same as pre-lockdown, although some are reporting slight increases. But like Chris in Outer London, we have to treat this with a little bit of caution. We are getting, anecdotal evidence that, sales fell through. Some sales that have fallen through during lockdown have been agreed post-lockdown at a slightly higher price, but it's too early to say that this is a trend. The properties that are that are doing very well are those typical country houses, so those houses with paddocks, outdoor pools, with good local amenities, easy access to a town and good schools, and still within commutable distance of London. A little bit on comparable evidence. As Chris and Mark have both said, we still, we always look for the best comparable evidence available. The country house market is slightly different. We have to cast our net a little bit further afield, but we always look to try and get the best and most up-to-date evidence we can, and that's true now as it was before lockdown. With regard to St George's Hill, as I say, this is an estate in Weybridge, and it's traditionally had its own unique market. Again, agents are reporting increased activity. But I think it's fair to say that the market on St George's Hill has been fairly slow in the past couple of years due to the stamp duty changes and Brexit, the EU referendum, all sorts of issues have compounded. And I think that, together with the fact that a large number of new properties seem to come to completion at the same time and onto the market. And this has meant that over the last few years there's been a higher number of properties for sale on the estate than has traditionally been the case. And this has put downward pressure on the prices. Most agents I've spoken to are currently of the opinion that the prices on St George's Hill at the moment are in a low ebb, and as a result, houses are perceived as being relatively good value. Most of the buyers are British and from London, and they're looking at the lower price band on the estate. So that's between 3.5 million to 5 million. The problem is there aren't many in that price band. So agents are more concerned about a potential lack of stock for those buyers wanting to buy at that level. There has been interest in the higher price bands, but it's been mostly focused on the sub £5 million mark. Some interest from foreign buyers, again, mainly Hong Kong, and I think that seems to be the case. Agents reporting a good start for the year on the Hill, with 8 completed sales so far this year and 6 currently under offer. And that's a much stronger start to the year than they expected. The market on Wentworth, again, it's fairly unique, and it is different to St George's Hill. Again, agents are reporting they've been busy since the end of lockdown, and again, most of the potential buyers are British and coming out of London. However, unlike St George's Hill, there's a current lack of stock, and this has caused a slight uplift in the prices on a year ago. Again, we're treating this with caution, but one agent I spoke to has reported 2 recent sales at over £1,000 a square foot. Now, going forward, as both Mark and Chris have said, it's difficult for us to predict. We're kind of in the middle of it at the moment. But this market's not affected so much by the end of the furlough scheme or the recently announced stamp duty changes. Typically, buyers for properties in this price band may not have a property to sell, and they will move when the appropriate property becomes available. So the lack of stock and the threat of a hard Brexit is more of a concern in this market. To summarise, I would say the short-term outlook is fairly positive, but longer-term more cautious. The expectation of most agents is that they will remain busy, maybe until the end of the year, and then slow down due to limited stock. Prices are expected to hold steady, with maybe some small increases in some areas for some property over the next few months. But longer term, the expectation is that prices will remain flat or fall slightly. Now, in terms of hotspots, I would say it's the perfect country property with paddocks and pools in villages near towns with good connections to London and good schools. So the areas around Sevenoaks, Guildford, Ascot, Windsor, Henley-on-Thames are all doing very well at the moment. But again, it's very much to do with the perfect property. Okay, that's the end of my talk. So I'll hand you back to Sophia.
Thank you very much, Jane. We're going to stay on the COVID-19 and London topic, but we're going to go over to the lettings market and get an update from Mark, how the lettings market has reacted to the pandemic. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and thank you very much, Jane. Okay, so I would say that the lettings market is not showing quite the promise of the sales market following lockdown. Rental values tend to be more resilient than capital values during a downturn. During the pandemic, the lettings market supply has been less affected by lockdown. Throughout April and May, the level of instructions was consistently over that of the same period last year, as owners hedged their bets and opted to let rather than to sell. While supply is catching up with demand in the sales market, the trend is reversed in the rental market, which has put a downwards pressure on rental values. Knight Frank has said an annual decline of 4.6%, and this is across Greater London, after a monthly fall of 0.8%. Furthermore, a number of large-scale property owners in central London have listed properties to rent as lockdown was lifted, which has further increased the supply. Now, rents tend to be linked more to income, and with the number of workers who are still on furlough or face the likelihood of redundancy or financial troubles, rents may fall further. Savills predict in London that there will be a 16.3% increase over a 5-year period, with a 1% reduction over 2020. However, some more recent stats actually contradict this. Now, with working from home, people found that they needed more space, outdoor space, and they didn't have to be in offices or travelling on public transport. So there was the desire to move, as the economic consequences of lockdown on tenants' incomes seems likely to continue to affect the level of rents. With the desire to maybe move out slightly for better value and a better quality of life, this may reduce the prime central London rental market, as there will be an increased supply in more central areas. Now, uncertainty amongst students surrounding the start of the next academic year and logistical and financial constraints around corporate relocations, and especially from overseas tenants, has also had a dampening effect on rental values. Some students are opting to defer university offers until 2021. Some overseas students and overseas employees are affected by travel restrictions. And people who move for school catchments may have to put their plans on hold for fear of the dreaded second wave. However, the situation has started to improve slightly. Students are beginning to act as more clarity emerges over their next academic years. There has, however, not been the normal spike of activity that we have over the summer period in previous years. During lockdown, people were advised to stay home, so tenants had little choice but to extend their tenancies rather than move, however, at reduced rents. And Hamptons International have provided a statistic that they're approximately 3.2% lower on renewal. Now, according to the latest data provided by Rightmove, rental asking prices are down by 18% in Zone 1, as they call it, and since February, and 8% in Zone 2. So as with the capital market, it remains to be seen what happens with the lettings market. And I'll now pass you back to Sophia again.
Thank you very much, Mark. We are now going to move away from the COVID-19 pandemic and move on to another topic that continues to be very relevant to both lenders, valuers, solicitors, and obviously tenants, and that is cladding. Steve is going to talk us through how the Grenfell disaster has affected the flat market and what do valuers need to be aware of when valuing buildings with cladding. So over to you, Steve.
Thanks very much, Sophia, and good afternoon, everyone. The Grenfell tragedy happened just over 3 years ago in June 2017. And as you'll know, whilst the fire was likely started by an electrical fault, I believe to a fridge inside one of the flats, it was exacerbated and spread rapidly due to the nature of the insulated cladding on the building, which, as it happened, had only been introduced when the building was refurbished in 2016. The cladding used on Grenfell is known as ACM, which stands for Aluminium Composite Material. And this is basically 2 skins of aluminium bonded to either side of a lightweight core. In the case of Grenfell, the lightweight core was of a combustible nature. So when the fire took hold, the thin aluminium sheets buckled under the heat and exposed the internal flammable insulation to the flames. The cladding had been installed onto the existing incombustible reinforced concrete frame in such a way that it left a gap and created a chimney effect where the flames sought oxygen and quickly travelled vertically. In the months following Grenfell, obviously extensive testing was undertaken to the cladding of high-rise blocks throughout the country, which established that in the region of 301 private sector blocks and 159 social sector blocks had combustible ACM cladding. The impact of all of this obviously being that almost immediately a large number of flats were rendered unmortgageable. So what are some of the actions that have been taken? Well, in October 2018, the government announced that they were releasing the first tranche of an estimated £400 million to local authorities and housing associations to cover the costs of removing and replacing ACM cladding, whilst obviously landlords of private blocks were expected to fund the removal costs themselves. In November 2018, the government gave councils authority to remove unsafe ACM cladding from private sector blocks which hadn't already done so, and to reclaim costs from the landlords. On the 21st of December 2018, the government introduced a ban on combustible materials on all new residential blocks over 18 metres in height, which is effectively 6 stories. And in May 2019, the government announced that it would fully fund the removal of dangerous ACM cladding on private sector buildings over 18 metres in height, where building owners have failed to do so. And this applied to around 170 privately owned high-rise blocks at a cost of approximately £600 million. And despite all this, in June 2019, the government announced that remediation of ACM cladding had been completed on just 7.4% of private sector buildings and 35.4% in the social residential sector. And concerns weren't just around the ACM cladding. In the March 2020 budget, the government announced a £1 billion building safety fund for buildings with dangerous non-ACM cladding systems. However, if your building's under 18 metres, you're excluded from the fund, and you're also reliant on the building owner making an application on a first come, first served basis. So what's the scale of the problem now? Well, whilst the government further announced last year that all Grenfell style cladding should be removed from buildings by June 2020, the latest figures reveal that some 246 tall residential buildings still have such cladding in place. And estimates being that approximately 23,000 households reside in these blocks. And it's not just buildings with ACM cladding that are at risk, with numerous other cladding types being identified as combustible. Indeed, it's been established that approximately 1,700 buildings have dangerous cladding. And this includes buildings with attachments such as balconies, which have potentially flammable material. And bear in mind that all these figures only relate to high-rise blocks over 18 metres or 6 stories in height, with potentially tens of thousands of medium-rise blocks all around the country still having cladding systems in place. So in terms of the impact, you can see that tens of thousands of leaseholders and flat owners in local authority and privately built blocks are now unable to remortgage or sell their properties until unsafe cladding has been replaced. And obviously, whilst these will have some form of cash value, as surveyors, any valuation figure we provide on a flat with cladding would be on the basis that the cladding system's safe. In addition, as is to be expected, the insurance premiums on these buildings have rocketed. So what's being done to address this from a valuation perspective and to protect lenders? The RICS, Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, introduced a form called the EWS1 External Wall Fire Review Form. And now on all valuations which are being undertaken on flats in blocks with cladding will request a copy of a completed EWS1 form. This form provides options for where external wall materials are unlikely to support combustion and also where combustible materials are present in external walls. The EWS1 form, which has a 5-year lifespan, must be completed by a person from one of the 21 relevant professional bodies approved by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, which include the Institution of Fire Engineers, Chartered Institute of Building and the Royal Institute of Building of British Architects. So for a block with cladding to be considered acceptable, then a satisfactory EWS1 form would be required, confirming that either external wall materials and attachments are unlikely to support combustion and no remedial works are required, or where combustible material is present in external walls, that the fire risk is sufficiently low and no remedial works are required. If a completed form is not available prior to release of the valuation, then we'll advise clearly within the report that the valuation is subject to receipt of a satisfactory form confirming that the cladding is not a fire risk. And you should be aware that whilst most lenders will not lend without a satisfactory EWS1 form, bear in mind that some lenders will still not lend if any form of cladding is present, regardless of whether such a form is available. And what about blocks under 18 metres in height? Well, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government advise that fire safety must be considered holistically on any multi-storey or multi-occupied building, irrespective of height. And whilst the EWS1 form is designed for high-rise blocks of 18 metres or above, there's still a risk for medium-rise blocks, and accordingly, we're still recommending a completed EWS1 form for flats within such blocks where there's any form of concern. So what are we seeing? Obviously, with the introduction of any new requirement, this can slow the process down, but we're always proactive in requesting the form, and we're finding that these are now being provided more readily, particularly on new builds with cladding, where we generally get presented with a form alongside the CML or UK Finance Disclosure Form as it's now known. Sometimes on second-hand blocks, the forms aren't immediately forthcoming and are not available prior to completion of our reports. However, in these circumstances, we would always specify that a satisfactory EWS1 form should be provided. A number of blocks will remain unmortgageable until cladding has been replaced, and whilst they have some form of cash value, this would not be a figure we'd be prepared to provide, as there's very limited comparable evidence of such units selling. And we consider it likely that the legislation will continue to tighten, particularly in relation to medium-rise blocks. Going forward, the process is likely to become slicker, and obviously, if more information is obtained up front, including the EWS1 form, then the process will speed up further. So thanks very much. Back to Sophia.
Thank you, Steve. And our last topic for today is HMOs. HMOs are becoming increasingly popular. We're seeing the level of valuation requests that we get for HMOs has increased significantly even in the last 12 months. Jane and Steve are going to talk us through how we value them and why our opinion of value is often different to the applicant's estimated value. And we're going to start off by going over to Jane.
Okay, thank you, Sophia. Hello, everyone again. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little, well, Steve and I are both going to talk a little bit about HMOs, how we approach the valuation and some of the issues that affect the valuation. But before I start, I'm just going to remind everybody what an HMO is, or house in multiple occupation. So it's a property that's let to 3 or more people who are living as 2 or more households and share some facilities. It can be a house or a flat, and it can be let on a room-by-room basis, or let on a single assured short-hold tenancy agreement to a group of individuals or friends who split the rent between themselves. So once we turn up at a property and we've established that it's an HMO, we undertake the inspection slightly differently than we would if it was a single family dwelling. We measure all the bedrooms, we measure the kitchen, we check, you know, obviously we'd make a note of all the bathrooms anyway, but particularly to pay careful attention to that. And we also check what fire measures have been put into the house. And the reason we do this is because if it is an HMO, it needs to meet a certain set of standards. And rather unhelpfully, each local authority has its own specific set of standards and requirements that houses in multiple occupation have to meet. So when we get back to our office, we then have to check that the house we've looked at meets the standards of the local authority. And this is important because if there's a bedroom, for example, that is too small, falls below the required room size, then we can't include that in the rental value, and that may or may not impact on the valuation overall. So having checked it against the standards, we then need to find out whether or not it needs to be licensed. And again, there are 3 forms of licensing, and again, each local authority will have its own specific requirements. The first licensing scheme is the mandatory licensing scheme, and that's quite straightforward. That requires every house in multiple occupation that's let to 5 or more people has to have a license. So it's quite straightforward, irrespective of where it is. The license is valid for 5 years, and it will state the number of people who are licensed to live in that property. There's the additional licensing scheme, and some local authorities have introduced additional licensing schemes which relate specifically to houses in multiple occupation that are not covered by the mandatory scheme. So we're talking about those let to 3 or 4 people. And it might be that a local authority is concerned about the standards of these in their borough and have decided to introduce this licensing scheme as a way of controlling the standards. And examples of local authorities who have additional licensing schemes are Kingston upon Thames, Haringey and Newham, but there are others. Finally, the selective licensing scheme. Now this is a scheme for all private rented property within a defined geographical area. So it can be the whole borough or within a certain area within a borough. And this is for all private rented properties. So by default, any houses in multiple occupation that are not covered by the mandatory scheme will be picked up by the selective licensing scheme. And boroughs who've introduced selective licensing scheme include Croydon, Southwark, Brent, but again, there are many others. So of course, what we need to do is check every time you value an HMO that it has what licensing schemes are relevant and that the property has the correct license. And again, this is important because if on site we see that a property is let to 6 people, but it's only licensed for 5, then we can't include the 6th rental income. And again, obviously this has a big impact on the rental income overall. And again, it may or may not impact on the overall capital value. So that covers the bit I was going to talk about. I'm going to pass over to Steve now, who's going to talk a little bit more in depth about the valuation process and some of the planning implications.
Thanks very much, Jane. Firstly, when valuing HMOs, there's no hard and fast rule. And in reality, each property has to be taken on its own merits and valued having consideration to its size, accommodation, layout and condition. I think it's probably a common misconception that all HMOs or investment properties of this ilk are valued on an investment basis by capitalising the rental income and at an appropriate yield. However, in reality, the majority of HMOs that we see are houses that have been converted, often with minimal adaptations to facilitate HMO usage. Accordingly, for the majority of HMOs, we'd be assessing the value of the property by looking at sales of single residential dwellings in the locality, whilst also reflecting, if appropriate, the expenses involved in adapting the property to meet HMO requirements, or in areas where there's limited demand for HMOs, the expense of converting back to a single residential dwelling. Certainly for more substantial HMOs, which perhaps have been purpose-built for the use or have been significantly extended and altered, and there would be unlikely to be a demand to convert them back to a single residential dwelling usage, then we would utilise the investment base of valuation. However, there are concerns over this method. Firstly, there's generally very limited sales evidence of directly comparable investment properties, with fairly few transactions taking place and most of the sales evidence coming from auction websites. Secondly, you have to be cautious of the yields being achieved on these properties, as the rental levels they're apparently achieving may not be reflective of market rent, and we obviously want to compare like for like. And these both lead on to the main issue, which is around the accuracy of the method, since even 0.5% difference in the yield applied could have a fairly significant impact on value. Accordingly, we'd always look to sense check our valuation to ensure that the value of the property sits within the general tone of values for the area. We'd do this ideally by finding sales of similar buildings occupied as HMOs in the locality, but more realistically by looking at sales of similar sized houses, or even comparing the value on a rate per square foot basis. Now, James talked about some of the regulations around HMOs and the fact that different local authorities have different requirements. And this is something that's very important, because when we're assessing in particular the rental value of a property, it may be that even though a property is being let as an 8-person HMO, local authority standards in the area may mean it can only be let to 6 people. So we have to be constantly up to date in this respect. And obviously, from a lender's perspective, you need to know whether the rental income is sustainable and whether the property complies in the first place. Another talking point's around planning, because whilst in general it is permitted development to convert a single residential dwelling, which falls within use class C3, to a small house in multiple occupation, which falls within use class C4, some local authorities have introduced what are called Article 4 directions, removing permitted development rights and ensuring that planning permission is sought for such a conversion. The main reason being to limit the number of HMOs in the locality. Now, what this can potentially create in these areas is a 2-tier market where HMOs with the relevant consent achieve higher values than similar sized single residential dwellings. At the moment, though, there's fairly limited evidence, and certainly we'd always wish to tread cautiously when considering comparable evidence in this respect. So to summarise, each property is considered on its own merits. We'll always have consideration to local authority planning and licensing requirements. We'll always look to ensure that the value of property sits within the general tone of values in the locality. A lot of people ask, is an HMO a good investment? Well, they certainly can be a good high-yielding investment, providing they're managed correctly in accordance with all the necessary local authority requirements. And thanks very much, and back to Sophia.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Jane. So that concludes the webinar. I just have one last question to our panel. If money was no object, where would you buy a property and why? And I want to start with Jane.
Okay, hello Sophia, thanks. Money no object, I would buy a beautiful country house in one of the Surrey villages near Abinjahammer or Sheer. That's what I would buy. Thank you.
Nice. Steve?
Obviously, being from Watford, anywhere outside would be absolutely fine. But no, I'd be probably somewhere in North London, somewhere with a bit of a space, garden. So I'd be looking at, say, Highgate or Primrose Hill with a nice villagey feel, or maybe closer to home, somewhere like Moore Park, or a village like Chipperfield, something like that.
Thank you, Steve. And over to Chris.
Yeah, I think I'd have to say money no object, probably a nice double-fronted period detached house in Wimbledon Village. Just a very nice location. Got just some fantastic facility, lovely shops, bars, restaurants, etc. down there. The transport links are very good. You've got Wimbledon Common, some very nice golf courses around that area, and also very good if you like tennis as well. So yeah, be Wimbledon Village for me.
I'm really looking forward to all these housewarming parties.
Yeah.
Mark, over to you.
A nice low-built house in Hampstead or Hampstead Garden suburb, I think would do me fine, with a nice sized garden.
Sounds great. For me, I would love one of those big country houses that Jane was talking about earlier, with a swimming pool and a paddock somewhere down here in East Sussex where we live right now. But if it was in London, having spent 16 years in North London, for me, it would definitely be Highgate. So that is the end of our webinar. A huge thank you to our panel, and of course a massive thank you to everyone who joined us today. I hope you have found it useful and insightful, and as always, if you have any questions at any time, anything we can do to help, you know where we are. Please just send us an email or pick up the phone and we will gladly help you. So thank you everyone, and have a great rest of the day.